2008, the global economy crashed. Our world changed forever. In America, Lehman Brothers had collapsed. The bank was holding a giant pile of bad debts, mostly bad housing loans. There was an international banking crisis. It gave the world a recession. 14 years later, another financial crisis is brewing in China, but the world knows very little about it. As we speak, a boycott campaign is underway in at least 86 Chinese cities. Thousands of home buyers have stopped paying their EMIs because they say they've not got their homes, so they will not pay back their loans. China has asked its banks to produce a list of bad debts. There's a growing risk of more defaults. China's property sector is on shaky ground. Banks have a debt pile of more than $9 trillion. The money was lent out to the property sector. First, leading developers defaulted, and now homeowners are willfully defaulting on their loans. Will a collapse of China's property sector start the next global financial crisis? On Gravitas tonight, we'll tell you how China could start a financial pandemic. What you saw happen last week, a protest in China crushed by officials. Who were the protesters? People who had lost their life savings. China's banks are going through a major crisis, and these are people from the Henan province. In the month of April, 4 banks in Henan stopped withdrawals, meaning people who had deposited money in these banks could not withdraw. The people struggled for months. They protested at least thrice, and every time the Chinese state responded with a fierce crackdown. They tried their best to crush the protest, but they failed to silence the protesters. China's banking regulator has now relented. It will compensate these depositors in Henan. It's a massive climb down for the Chinese state and a win for the people. But our story does not end there. In fact, it just begins. The Henan banks are just the beginning of China's nightmare. There are many more hidden skeletons. Chinese banks have debt worth $9.2 trillion. Let me repeat that. Debt worth $9.2 trillion. This money was given out to the distressed property sector of China, mostly to home buyers. But now the money is not coming back because people have not got their homes, so they've stopped paying their EMIs. The scale of the problem is massive. This is a mortgage crisis, a mortgage revolt in China. Home buyers in more than 50 Chinese cities are defaulting on their debts, and they are doing it willingly. We've said this before, China's debt problem is like a cancer, and this cancer is now spreading through their economy. The repercussions could be grave and the impact could be global. On Gravitas tonight, we'll bring you the full story. We'll tell you how the Chinese economy is staring at a collapse. We'll start with the mortgage boycott. Look at this headline, China mortgage boycott data erased by censors as crisis spreads. This story broke today. And when Chinese censors swing into action, it is often an indication that there is a big problem. These censors took down some documents. What was in the documents? Data about mortgage boycotts in the country, information about the projects that are stalled, images of letters by home buyers. These are the people who declared they will not be paying their EMIs anymore. And China is trying to hide all of this data. So how big is the problem? In one word, massive. We have estimates. Home buyers have stopped mortgage payments in at least 100 projects. Where are these projects? In more than 50 cities. Numbers from the leaked data set suggest that the problem is much bigger. According to one report, the boycott is happening in as many as 86 cities. How many projects? More than 230. How many people have stopped paying EMIs in China? We don't have the exact numbers, but a Chinese news outlet has published a report. It has pictures of the leaked data set. Now look at this. There are more than 80 entries on this list alone. 46,000 home buyers have suspended payments in 14 projects. 46,000. These projects are in central, southern and eastern China. So people are refusing to pay EMIs in 80 cities. You can imagine the scale of the crisis. Why had they suspended payments? Because they've not got their homes, the ones that they bought. The developers have not finished those projects. Most of these projects have failed. And these projects belong to the developers who recently defaulted. The biggest culprit is a name you would recognize, Evergrande. It was the largest property developer in China. Now it has the largest debt pile in the world. 35% of the projects facing a revolt today belong to Evergrande. Home buyers have every right to be angry. If they're not getting their homes, why should they keep paying their EMIs? And all of this is bad news for the Chinese state, because if the boycotts continue, there will be more defaults. How much money are we talking about? At least $58 billion. That's the value of all the loans in delayed housing projects. How will China revive these projects? Its options are limited. China's property sector has become one of its biggest liabilities. Recent defaults have put banks at risk. The actual debt pile is much bigger. Again, I have some numbers. Chinese banks have lent $9.2 trillion to the property sector. And more than half of these are mortgage loans. In the last 1 year, several developers have defaulted. 28 out of China's top 100 developers have either defaulted, have either failed to pay their loans or sought an extension from their creditors. Now, here's why we say that the recovery is going to be tough. In the first half of this year, 2022, property sales plummeted in China by 72% in 1 year. 72% drop. Chinese regulators are pressing the panic button. They've told banks to come clean. China wants to know how big the mortgage debt pile is. There are plans to infuse cash into the economy. Reports say Beijing could pump $1.1 trillion. This money will go into infrastructure projects. It will lift the construction sector and, by extension, lift the Chinese economy. At least that's the hope. Chinese regulators say they will help the property sector too, but there's no plan yet. Housing projects going bust, borrowers unable to repay debt, and banks fearing a collapse. We've seen all of this before. This is exactly what happened in the year 2008, the subprime mortgage crisis in America. That's what it was. It gave the world a recession. Going by one estimate, over 2 million homes went through a foreclosure then. How much did American households lose? At least $17 trillion in all. What's happening in China is eerily similar to America's subprime crisis. The bigger problem is the fact that China is trying to hide all of it. The world needs to know about China's bad loans. In 2020, it hid the spread of the Wuhan virus and the world got a pandemic. In 2022, China is hiding another crisis that could give us a financial pandemic. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.